October 2002 arrived with autumn colors and cool air across the Washington, D.C. suburbs. Leaves covered sidewalks. Children waited for school buses. Commuters filled gas stations. Everything was ordinary, peaceful, and routine. Then, suddenly, it wasn't. On October 2nd, without warning, a single gunshot cracked through Montgomery County, Maryland. A man buying groceries collapsed dead in a parking lot. Minutes later, another shot, then another. Within 3 weeks, 17 people would be murdered across the nation. 10 died in the D.C. suburbs alone. The victims were ordinary people living ordinary lives, young and old, black and white, men and women. They died at gas stations and parking lots, on street corners and school steps, during moments when they felt safest. None of them saw what was coming. There were no patterns, no clear motives, no mercy. People began running in zigzag patterns when pumping gas, desperately hoping unpredictability would save them. Schools locked children indoors during recess. Parents refused to let kids take buses or walk home. Fear spread faster than news could keep up. Residents described feeling paralyzed by uncertainty. They couldn't shop, couldn't work, couldn't live normally. One police officer captured the desperation perfectly. It felt like the water was over my head. We were always moving behind. We couldn't get ahead of what he was doing. It was like chasing shadows. For millions in the Washington, D.C. region, one chilling message became unmistakable. Everyone was at risk, everywhere. You could be killed mowing your lawn, filling your gas tank, waiting for a bus, loading groceries, or simply walking home. The most mundane activities of daily life had become potentially fatal. Residents who had lived safely for years suddenly questioned every outdoor moment. One woman recalled the psychological devastation. "I felt like the water was over my head." That captured the feeling perfectly. The entire region held its breath for 3 weeks, wondering when and where the sniper would strike next. Would it be your neighborhood? Would it be someone you loved? Montgomery County was a small, wealthy suburb just north of Washington, D.C. It averaged only 15 to 20 murders per year. This area represented safety, stability, and suburban tranquility. But October 2002 changed everything forever. In just 23 days, the body count would rival an entire year's worth of violence. The first fatal victim was James Martin, a 55-year-old program analyst for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. He had simply stopped at a grocery store parking lot on his way home from work. A single bullet struck him in the chest. He collapsed between parked cars and shopping bags scattered across the pavement. He was just buying groceries for dinner. By the end of that first day, 5 people lay dead. Within a week, 13 more had fallen. Each death sent fresh waves of panic through the region. Schools became fortresses with children confined indoors. Gas stations erected protective barriers around pumps. Shopping centers posted armed guards. The terror wasn't just physical. It was psychological, designed to make people question their safety everywhere, always. Parents held their children closer. Neighbors watched each other suspiciously. The entire social fabric of a prosperous region began unraveling under the weight of random violence. Nobody knew who was pulling the trigger. Nobody knew where death would strike next. That uncertainty was the most terrifying weapon of all. To understand this horror, we must travel back decades to a small boy in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who lost everything at age 3. John Allen Williams entered the world on December 31, 1960. His parents, Ernest and Eva, struggled to survive in the segregated South. When John was still a toddler, his mother received devastating news: breast cancer. The family moved to New Orleans seeking better medical care, hoping for a miracle. Eva Williams died when John was only 3 years old. His father abandoned the family shortly after his mother's death. Young John never developed memories of his parents together. He would spend his life searching for the connection he had lost so early. His grandfather and aunt took him in, but the psychological damage of parental loss during infancy was profound and lasting. School records show John was an average student who kept mostly to himself. He had some friends, but never formed deep, meaningful connections with peers. Teachers noted nothing remarkable about him. No behavioral problems, but no standout achievements either. He seemed to be searching for something, anything, to fill the enormous emptiness inside him. As a teenager, John watched older men in his neighborhood, particularly military veterans, who seemed confident and purposeful. He saw in them a possible escape route from poverty and emotional abandonment. The military represented everything his childhood had lacked: structure, discipline, clear rules, and a sense of belonging to something larger than himself. At 18, in August 1978, John enlisted in the Louisiana Army National Guard. He chose combat engineering as his specialty, seeking the technical skill and structured environment the military promised. The Army gave him exactly what he craved: rules, expectations, and a clear chain of command. For the first time since his mother's death, John had stability and purpose. He performed well enough in initial service that on November 6, 1985, he transferred to the regular Army. The transition meant more training and new skills. The Army trained him as a mechanic, truck driver, and metal specialist. He learned to fix vehicles, operate heavy equipment, and work with metal fabrication. But his most significant training came on the rifle range. John qualified with the M16 rifle, the standard weapon for Army soldiers. He didn't just pass the basic requirements. He earned the Expert Rifleman's Badge, the highest of 3 marksmanship levels the Army awards regular soldiers. This meant John could consistently hit targets from 50 to 300 meters away. He had to score at least 36 out of 40 targets to achieve this elite rating. His service took him to Fort Lewis in 1985 with the 15th Engineer Battalion. He settled into military life, following orders and completing his duties efficiently. The structure worked for him. He rose through the ranks steadily, showing competence and reliability. Then in 1991, the Gulf War called. John deployed with his unit to the Middle East. His company had a specific and dangerous job: dismantling Iraqi chemical warfare rockets. This work required precision, careful planning, and extraordinary nerve. One mistake meant death. John completed his deployment and returned home with 3 military medals. The Army had given him everything: purpose, identity, and recognition. By the time Sergeant John Williams received his honorable discharge in April 1994, after 16 years of service, he had become an expert marksman and disciplined soldier. He left with skills that few civilians could match. But he also left with something darker: absolute confidence in his abilities with a weapon and a sense of entitlement to respect that civilian life would never provide. Civilian life proved harder than John Williams expected. The structure and clear purpose that defined his military years disappeared overnight. Jobs felt meaningless. People seemed ungrateful. Nothing satisfied him. When he left the Army in April 1994, after 16 years of service, Williams thought his skills and discipline would translate easily into civilian employment. They didn't. He tried working as a mechanic, using the training the Army had given him, finding jobs at repair shops throughout the region. But he couldn't stay anywhere long. The work felt empty compared to military service. He had no mission, no rank, no unit, no sense of larger purpose. He was just another mechanic, changing oil and fixing brakes for customers who didn't appreciate his expertise. He moved between jobs frequently, auto shops, security positions, odd jobs. Nothing held his interest. The problem wasn't the work itself, but rather the absence of structure and meaning. In the military, every task connected to a larger mission. Orders came down the chain of command. Success was measured and recognized by superiors. Civilian work felt empty and pointless by comparison. His first marriage had already ended in divorce while he was still serving. The details remained sparse in public records, but the relationship had simply failed. He had no children from this marriage, no lasting connection to his first wife. In 1987, while still in the Army, Williams made a decision that would reshape his entire identity. At age 26, he joined the Nation of Islam, an African-American religious and political organization founded in the 1930s. The organization taught that Black Americans were the original people and that white society had systematically oppressed them for centuries. The Nation of Islam promoted Black self-sufficiency, strict discipline, and complete separation from white America. Williams changed his name to John Allen Muhammad, taking the name of the Islamic prophet to signify his deep commitment to the faith. In Islam, this name carried profound spiritual significance. His conversion was specifically to the Nation of Islam's unique version, which differed significantly from mainstream Islamic practice. The Nation of Islam focused heavily on racial identity and political activism alongside religious teachings. The organization gave Muhammad structure similar to what the military had provided. The Nation of Islam demanded strict discipline from members. They had to dress properly, speak respectfully, avoid drugs and alcohol completely, and follow rigid behavioral codes. Muhammad thrived under these expectations and demands. He attended meetings at Nation of Islam temples, studying the writings of Elijah Muhammad, the organization's longtime leader. He listened to sermons by Louis Farrakhan, who led the Nation of Islam during the 1980s and 1990s. The teachings about Black pride and white oppression resonated deeply with Muhammad's own sense of abandonment and anger. In 1995, the Nation of Islam organized the Million Man March in Washington, D.C. The event called for Black men to gather on the National Mall to demonstrate unity and commitment to improving their communities. Organizers expected maybe 200,000 participants. An estimated 400,000 to 850,000 men actually attended, making it one of the largest gatherings in Washington history. Muhammad volunteered to provide security for the march. He wore a suit and stood in assigned positions, helping manage crowds and watching for threats. Being part of this massive demonstration of Black solidarity gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since leaving the military. He stood shoulder to shoulder with thousands of men, all committed to the same cause. For one day, he belonged to something bigger than himself again. That feeling would define his search for meaning from that moment forward. After the march, Muhammad returned to normal life, but the experience stayed with him. He had glimpsed the kind of belonging and purpose he desperately craved. Regular civilian work couldn't compete with that feeling. His second marriage to a woman named Mildred brought 3 children, a son and 2 daughters. For a while, family life seemed to provide the purpose and structure he needed. Muhammad worked to support them. He tried to be a good father and husband, but his personality began changing in ways that deeply frightened Mildred. Mohammed became increasingly controlling. He wanted to know exactly where Mildred went, who she talked to, and what she did every single moment. He monitored her activities obsessively. When she didn't follow his expectations, he became angry and threatening. He made terrifying statements about killing her or taking the children to places where she could never find them. Mildred tried desperately to make the marriage work for the children's sake. She hoped Mohammed would eventually calm down and return to the man she had married. Instead, his behavior worsened dramatically. His threats became more explicit and violent. He spoke about harming her if she didn't obey his rules. The household became filled with tension and fear. In 1998, desperate to protect herself and her children, Mildred made the difficult decision to file for divorce. She also obtained a restraining order requiring Mohammed to stay away from her and the children. The court granted her full custody of the 3 children. Mohammed was allowed only supervised visitation, but could not take them alone. The custody decision destroyed Mohammed emotionally. He believed the children belonged with him, that the court system had unjustly stolen his family. His anger toward Mildred became obsessive and all-consuming. He blamed her for everything wrong in his life. Friends later testified that Mohammed talked constantly about getting his children back, whatever it took. He became fixated on revenge. In early 1999, during a supervised visit with his children, Mohammed made a desperate and illegal decision. He took all 3 children and disappeared. He didn't return them to their mother. Mildred came to pick them up and found them gone. She immediately called police and reported the kidnapping. Authorities issued warrants for Mohammed's arrest, but he had already left the state with the children. Mohammed drove across the country with his 3 kidnapped children, using stolen credit cards to buy gas and food. He used forged documents to move around without detection. He left no clear trail for authorities to follow. He eventually boarded a plane to Antigua, a small Caribbean island nation with no extradition treaty with the United States. American authorities couldn't force him to return. In Antigua, Mohammed rented a small place and attempted to establish a normal life with his children. He found work at an electronics store. He enrolled the children in school. He told people he was a single father making a fresh start. Nobody suspected he was a fugitive who had kidnapped his own kids. Mohammed spent his days working and his nights consumed by anger. He was angry at Mildred for divorcing him. He was angry at the court system for taking his children. He was angry at American society for what he perceived as systematic injustice and racism. His mind circled these grievances constantly, reinforcing his rage. He began planning revenge, though he didn't yet know exactly what form it would take. He wanted to hurt those who had hurt him. He wanted to make powerful people feel powerless. He wanted to create fear and chaos across America. But Mohammed knew he couldn't accomplish this alone. He was one person with limited resources. He needed help. He needed someone young and vulnerable and willing to do anything for approval and belonging. He needed a tool that could be shaped and controlled. Soon, fate would place exactly such a person into his life. Lee Boyd Malvo was born on February 18, 1985, in Kingston, Jamaica. His mother, Una James, was a single parent struggling desperately to provide for her son. His biological father was absent from the beginning, offering no support or connection. Una worked multiple jobs to keep them afloat, but stability seemed impossible to find. Lee bounced between relatives, his grandmother, then an aunt, then back to his mother. Each move meant new schools, new neighborhoods, new faces. He never stayed anywhere long enough to form lasting friendships or connections. Anna James loved her son deeply, but was often too busy working to spend meaningful time with him. Lee learned early how to take care of himself. He came home to empty apartments, made his own meals, and did his homework alone. School records from Jamaica show Lee was intelligent but withdrawn. Teachers noted he had potential but seemed distracted and disconnected. He struggled to focus in class and rarely participated in group activities. Other children saw him as the quiet kid who kept to himself. At home, Lee faced challenges that went far beyond his mother's absence. He later disclosed to therapists and attorneys that starting at age 5, a babysitter had sexually abused him repeatedly. He said this abuse continued with different family members throughout his childhood. These traumatic experiences, which he kept secret for years, deeply shaped his understanding of relationships and trust. Anna wanted better opportunities for her son. Jamaica's economy offered limited prospects, especially for single mothers without resources. She heard about work opportunities in Antigua and decided to move there. In 1999, when Lee was 14, they relocated to the island. Antigua was supposed to be a fresh start, a new beginning. Una found work and Lee enrolled in a new school. But within months, Una learned about a better job opportunity in Fort Myers, Florida. The pay was significantly better than anything available in Antigua. She made a difficult choice. She would go to Florida first, establish herself firmly, and then send for Lee. It would only be temporary, she promised herself and her son. This decision would haunt Una for the rest of her life. Una arranged for 14-year-old Lee to stay with friends while she got situated. She promised it would only be temporary. She would send for him as soon as she could afford it. Lee found himself once again in a pattern he knew too well, waiting for his mother to come back, waiting and hoping for connection. He attended school but struggled to concentrate on his studies. He had no close friends on the island. He spent most of his time by himself, reading or wandering around the neighborhood. He desperately needed a father figure, someone to provide guidance and stability his life had always lacked. He was vulnerable, searching for belonging, desperate for someone to pay attention to him. He was lonely in ways that only abandoned children understand. This made him the perfect target for someone like John Allen Muhammad. In late 1999 or early 2000, a 15-year-old boy walked into an electronics store in Antigua. The exact date wasn't recorded, but what happened there changed both their lives forever. The boy's name was Lee Boyd Malvo. Behind the counter stood John Muhammad, working a temporary job while hiding from American authorities with his 3 kidnapped children. Their eyes met. They started talking. Lee was 15 years old, alone, and looking for a father figure. Muhammad was 40 years old, on the run, and looking for something too, though Lee couldn't have known what that was. The friendship between them developed quickly and naturally. Muhammad recognized something in the teenage boy. He saw loneliness, vulnerability, and a desperate need for approval and affection. Lee saw in Muhammad the father figure he had never had. Muhammad was confident, well-spoken, and genuinely interested in him. For Lee, this attention felt like everything he had been missing his entire life. Muhammad told Lee to call him by his first name. He invited the teenager to visit him at work. They talked about religion, politics, and life. Muhammad shared his views on the world, speaking with the authority of someone who had served in the military and traveled. Lee listened closely to every word, absorbing everything. Within weeks, Lee was spending more time with Muhammad than with anyone else. Muhammad bought him meals, gave him small gifts, and treated him like a son. He told Lee about his own 3 children, though he didn't mention he had kidnapped them. Mohammed presented himself as a devoted father, trying to make a life for his kids in difficult circumstances. Under Una's approval, Mohammed moved Lee temporarily into his apartment. She saw a responsible adult who seemed to care about her son. Mohammed began Lee's education in earnest. He taught him about the Nation of Islam and its teachings. He spoke about black pride, self-sufficiency, and the wrongs committed against African Americans throughout history. Lee absorbed these lessons completely. Mohammed represented knowledge and strength and purpose. In March 2001, Mohammed converted Lee to Islam. This was more than a religious conversion. It was another step in Mohammed's systematic process of reshaping Lee's identity completely. Lee began to see the world entirely through Mohammed's eyes. He accepted Mohammed's interpretations of events without any question or critical thinking. Mohammed also began isolating Lee from his mother systematically and deliberately. This was a textbook grooming technique used by predators around the world. When Una called from Florida to check on her son, Mohammed controlled the conversations completely. Sometimes he told Lee his mother had called when she hadn't, claiming she asked about him but was too busy to talk long. Other times, when Una actually did call, Mohammed simply didn't tell Lee. He would answer the phone, speak briefly with Una, and then hang up without mentioning it to Lee. Mohammed crafted a narrative designed to break the bond between mother and son permanently. He told Lee that Una had chosen money over family. She left Lee behind in Antigua while she pursued work in America. She could have stayed and found work in Antigua, but America was more important to her than he was. Mohammed reframed all of Una's sacrifices, the multiple jobs, the separation, as evidence that she didn't really love him. He poisoned Lee's mind against his own mother. The manipulation went far deeper than words alone. Mohammed became Lee's entire world. He provided food, shelter, and emotional support. He taught Lee about religion and politics. He trained him physically. He gave him structure and purpose that had been missing his entire life. Lee had never experienced this level of consistent attention from an adult. He became completely dependent on Mohammed for everything he needed. The relationship between them grew increasingly complex and darker over time. Mohammed sexually abused Lee during this period in Antigua. Later, in a 2012 interview, Lee would tell a reporter that Mohammed compared their relationship to what a pimp does to a woman. This deeply disturbing comparison, twisted as it was, accurately described the complete power dynamic between them. Mohammed had absolute control. Lee felt he couldn't say no. He believed he had nowhere else to go and no one else who cared about him. In early 2001, Mohammed told Lee they needed to leave Antigua. He explained that American authorities were getting closer to finding him and the 3 kidnapped children. Mohammed had been careful using false documents and staying off official records, but he knew his time on the island was limited. Someone might recognize the children. Someone might report him to authorities. He needed to move immediately. Mohammed made plans to return to the United States despite the outstanding warrants for his arrest. He obtained false documents for himself and Lee. He had already been living under false pretenses with forged identification, so getting more fake papers was simply an extension of his existing criminal activity. They traveled to Miami with Mohammed's 3 children. The journey involved multiple flights and careful movement through airports, where Mohammed hoped no one would recognize him or the children. Lee entered the United States completely illegally. He had no visa, no passport, no legal documentation whatsoever.
He simply followed Muhammad, who told him where to go and what to do. Lee never questioned any of this. By this point, Muhammad's control over him was total. If Muhammad said they were going to Miami, they went to Miami. If Muhammad said to use false documents, Lee used false documents without hesitation.
The teenager who had walked into that electronics store in Antigua, searching for a father figure, had been transformed into someone who would follow Muhammad anywhere, do anything Muhammad asked. Muhammad had achieved complete psychological control over Lee's mind and behavior. From Miami, the group made their way north to Fort Myers, Florida. This was where Una James had been working for months, sending money back when she could, trying to establish herself so she could eventually bring Lee to live with her permanently. Muhammad knew exactly where to find her. When Una opened her door and saw her son, she was overwhelmed with emotion. She hadn't seen Lee in many months. She hugged him and cried tears of joy. She was grateful to Muhammad for bringing Lee safely to Florida. She had no idea what had been happening to her son during the time they were separated. She couldn't have imagined the abuse and manipulation. Muhammad reunited Lee with his mother, but he didn't leave. He stayed in Fort Myers, inserting himself into their household. He told Una that Lee needed male guidance and structure. He offered to help raise Lee while she worked. Una, who was struggling financially and working long hours, saw this as generous support. She accepted his help gratefully. This arrangement continued for some time in Florida, but Muhammad had larger plans. He told Lee about opportunities in Washington State. He said they could both work there and Lee could attend better schools. He painted a picture of a fresh start in Bellingham, a small city near the Canadian border where Muhammad claimed to have connections. Una, once again focused on her work and trusting Muhammad's judgment, agreed to let Lee go to Washington with him. She thought this was a temporary arrangement that would benefit her son. She had no way of knowing she was sending Lee away with someone who was systematically destroying his sense of self and preparing him to become a killer.
In late 2001, Muhammad and Lee traveled across the country to Bellingham, Washington. Muhammad enrolled Lee in Bellingham High School, falsely listing himself as Lee's father on the paperwork. Lee attended classes under the name John Lee Malvo, taking Muhammad's first name as his own. His classmates later described him as quiet and distant. He didn't make friends. He didn't join clubs or sports teams. He came to school, sat through classes silently, and left. Teachers found him polite, but completely disconnected from school life. No one suspected what was happening at home. Muhammad and Lee lived in a homeless shelter in Bellingham. They slept in bunk beds surrounded by other displaced people. But even in this crowded space, Lee remained isolated. Muhammad was his only constant companion, his only source of guidance and approval. In early 2002, Muhammad's plans for Lee Malvo became clear and concrete. The abstract talk about revenge and making statements transformed into practical preparation for murder. Muhammad began weapons training that went far beyond anything Lee had experienced. This wasn't teaching a teenager to shoot targets for sport. This was creating a killer with military precision. Muhammad took Lee to remote forested areas outside Bellingham, Washington. They drove miles from the city, finding logging roads and abandoned trails where gunshots wouldn't attract attention. The Pacific Northwest offered countless isolated locations perfect for their purposes. Muhammad selected spots carefully, always considering sightlines, escape routes, and the likelihood of encountering other people. The training started with basics. Lee had never fired a gun before meeting Muhammad. He had never held a rifle or understood how firearms worked. Muhammad began with safety procedures, teaching Lee how to check if a weapon was loaded, how to engage and disengage safeties, and how to handle firearms safely. Then came marksmanship instruction. Muhammad taught Lee everything the army had taught him. He showed Lee how to hold a rifle properly, tucking the stock against his shoulder, keeping his elbow down, maintaining a stable platform. He explained sight alignment and sight picture, teaching Lee to focus on the front sight while keeping the target and rear sight slightly blurred. Breathing control was critical. Muhammad drilled Lee on the natural respiratory pause that occurs after exhaling, the moment when the body is most still. Take your shot in that pause, Muhammad instructed. Breathe in, breathe out halfway. Hold it, squeeze the trigger. Lee practiced this breathing pattern hundreds of times until it became automatic and instinctive. As Lee improved, Muhammad increased the difficulty constantly. He moved targets farther away, forcing Lee to estimate distance and adjust his aim precisely. He made Lee shoot from different positions, standing, kneeling, prone, sitting. He timed Lee's shots, pushing him to fire accurately under pressure and time constraints. He created scenarios where Lee had to identify which target to hit first among multiple options. Lee was becoming a sniper. But Muhammad didn't just teach Lee how to shoot, he taught him how to think like a sniper. They discussed concealment and how to select shooting positions that offered cover and escape routes. Muhammad explained ballistics, how wind affects bullets, how gravity pulls them down over distance, how different ammunition performs differently. He taught Lee to read terrain and identify vulnerable targets. Most importantly, Muhammad worked relentlessly to eliminate any hesitation Lee might feel about shooting people. During their training sessions, Muhammad talked constantly about targets. He never called them people or victims. They were always targets or objects. He desensitized Lee to the idea of killing through constant repetition and depersonalization. He filled their training time with ideological conditioning. He talked endlessly about injustice, corruption, and the need for action. He told Lee that society had failed both of them. He painted vivid pictures of the world they would create together after completing their mission. Lee absorbed all of this conditioning completely. In February 2002, Muhammad decided Lee was ready for his first real test. He identified a specific target with personal significance. The target wasn't directly the woman he wanted dead, but her aunt. Tenna Nicole Cook's aunt was Issa Nichols. Nichols had a history with Muhammad that made her, in his mind, deserving of death. Years earlier, Nichols had worked for Muhammad's auto repair business and had been friends with both Muhammad and his ex-wife Mildred. When Muhammad's marriage collapsed and he became increasingly abusive, Nichols sided with Mildred. She encouraged Mildred to file for divorce. She helped Mildred contact police when Muhammad kidnapped their children. She testified in court during the custody proceedings. Muhammad never forgave her. In his distorted worldview, Nichols was responsible for destroying his family. She had turned his wife against him. She had helped authorities take his children. She deserved to die. And her death would serve multiple purposes: revenge against someone he hated and a test of Lee's ability to follow through on killing a real person. On February 16, 2002, Muhammad drove Lee to a house on East 34th Street in Tacoma, Washington. It was evening when they arrived. Muhammad pointed out the home and gave Lee his orders. The instructions were clear and simple. Knock on the door, shoot whoever answers, and return immediately to the car. Muhammad had borrowed a .45 caliber handgun from a friend, telling the friend they needed it for target practice. He gave this gun to Lee. A handgun made more sense at close range than a rifle. Muhammad parked down the street where he could watch the house, but wouldn't be immediately connected to what was about to happen. Lee walked up to the front door calmly. Inside, Kenya Cook was alone with her 6-month-old baby daughter. Cook was staying with her aunt to escape troubles with an abusive boyfriend. She thought the house was a safe haven.
She was changing her daughter's diaper when the doorbell rang. Cook walked to the door and opened it. She saw a teenager standing there. Before she could speak or react, Lee fired once. The .45 caliber bullet struck her in the face at point-blank range. Cook died instantly, collapsing in the doorway. Her baby remained on the changing table, unharmed, but now motherless. Lee turned and walked back to the car with mechanical precision, just as Muhammad had instructed. He showed no emotion, no hesitation, no remorse. The Tacoma Police Department investigated Cook's murder thoroughly, but had almost nothing to work with. There were no witnesses to the actual shooting. Neighbors heard a gunshot but hadn't seen the shooter clearly. The crime seemed random and motiveless. Detectives had no reason to connect it to Muhammad or Malvo. The .45 caliber handgun would eventually be traced back to the friend who had loaned it to Muhammad. But that wouldn't happen until after Muhammad and Lee were arrested 8 months later for the D.C. sniper attacks. For now, Tina Cook's case went cold. Muhammad and Lee left Washington State shortly after the murder. They drove south through Oregon and California, then turned east. Muhammad kept them moving constantly, never staying anywhere long enough to establish patterns or attract attention. They slept in the car most nights, occasionally checking into cheap motels where Muhammad paid cash and used false names. Lee was no longer hesitating. He was no longer conflicted. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He had become a killer. By late summer 2002, Muhammad decided they needed better equipment. The various handguns and rifles they had been using were adequate for close-range shootings, but Muhammad's plans required something more powerful and accurate. He wanted a rifle that could kill from hundreds of meters away. He wanted a Bushmaster XM15, the civilian semi-automatic version of the military M16 rifle he had trained with in the Army. This rifle fired .223 caliber ammunition, the same as the M16. It was accurate, reliable, and powerful enough to kill with a single shot at considerable distances. It was also expensive, costing around $1,000. Muhammad couldn't legally purchase the rifle. He had a restraining order against him from his ex-wife, which made it illegal under federal law for him to buy or possess firearms. Even if he tried to use false identification, the background check system might flag him. So Muhammad decided to steal one. He drove Lee back across the country to Tacoma, Washington, where they had lived earlier. Muhammad knew about Bullseye Shooter Supply, a gun store with a terrible reputation for security and record-keeping. The store had been cited repeatedly by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives for violations. Guns disappeared from Bullseye's inventory regularly, with no explanation for where they went. Muhammad and Lee visited Bullseye in early September 2002. They looked at various firearms on display casually. Muhammad pointed out the Bushmaster XM15 to Lee and gave him simple instructions. "Take it and walk out," he said. The store's lack of security and poor inventory management meant store employees often didn't notice when guns went missing until long after the fact. Lee, who had by now committed multiple shootings and robberies, had no hesitation about theft. He waited for an opportune moment when employees were distracted, then took the Bushmaster rifle and walked out of the store. No one stopped him. No alarms went off. They got in their car and drove away with the weapon that would kill 10 people. Bullseye Shooter Supply wouldn't realize the rifle was missing for some time. When they finally noticed it was gone from inventory, they had no record of selling it and no explanation for its disappearance. Muhammad now had the weapon he needed, but he still had one critical problem to solve: how to shoot people from concealment without being seen. On September 11, 2002, Muhammad stopped in New Jersey and purchased a used blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice.
The car had previously been used as an undercover police vehicle by the Bordentown Police Department before being sold at auction. It was unremarkable looking, the kind of sedan that blended into traffic. Muhammad paid cash for it and registered the vehicle in his own name using the license plate number NDA21Z. Muhammad chose this specific type of car for a reason. The Caprice was large, with a spacious trunk and a back seat that could be modified. It was mechanically reliable and wouldn't break down during their operations. Most importantly, as a former police car, it looked authoritative and wouldn't attract suspicion from actual police who might pass it on the road. Muhammad immediately began modifying the Caprice to serve as a mobile sniper platform. He found a location where he could work on the car without being observed or interrupted. Using basic hand tools, Muhammad cut a hole in the trunk lid near where the license plate was attached. The hole was approximately 2 inches in diameter, large enough to fit a rifle barrel through, but small enough to be inconspicuous from a distance. Next, Muhammad removed the sheet metal panel that separated the passenger compartment from the trunk. This involved removing the back seat, accessing the trunk from inside the car, and cutting the metal barrier carefully. The modification created a passageway large enough for a person to crawl through. This design meant Lee could sit normally in the back seat while Muhammad drove. When they spotted a target, Lee could climb through the opening into the trunk without Muhammad stopping the car or either of them exiting the vehicle. Once in the trunk, Lee could lie flat, position the Bushmaster rifle so its barrel extended through the hole near the license plate, aim through the rifle's scope, and fire. After shooting, Lee could pull back into the passenger compartment, and Muhammad could drive away immediately. From outside, the vehicle looked completely normal. The modification was invisible to casual observers. Muhammad tested the setup extensively. He drove to empty areas, had Lee practice climbing into the trunk repeatedly, and verified that Lee could aim and fire comfortably from inside. They practiced the timing and mechanics dozens of times. Lee discovered that firing from inside the trunk was actually easier than shooting from standing positions. Lying prone provided a stable platform. The trunk's walls protected him from wind. The confined space helped him stay focused on the target. Muhammad was satisfied with the results. Now came the final phase of preparation. They needed to test their complete system: the modified Caprice, the Bushmaster rifle, and Lee's training, before launching the major attacks they had planned. They would verify everything worked as planned in real conditions with real targets. These final tests would also serve another purpose: confusing police by creating separate incidents that wouldn't immediately be connected to the later attacks. Muhammad drove south from New Jersey into Maryland, positioning themselves for what would become one of the most terrifying crime sprees in American history. Everything was ready. The gun was loaded. The car was modified. Lee was trained. And Muhammad's rage had finally found its perfect instrument. On September 5, 2002, Muhammad and Lee drove through Clinton, Maryland, a suburb in Prince George's County, just south of Washington, D.C. Clinton was far enough from the city to avoid heavy police presence, but close enough to the Capitol Beltway for quick access to multiple escape routes. This made it ideal for Muhammad's purposes. Around 10:30 p.m., they found their target. Paul LaRufa, a 55-year-old restaurant owner, was closing Margellina, his Italian restaurant. LaRufa had owned the restaurant for years and had built a loyal customer base. He was known in the community as hardworking and friendly.
He stayed late most nights, making sure everything was clean and secure before going home. Muhammad parked the Caprice in a position where Lee could see LaRufa clearly through the trunk opening. Lee climbed into the trunk through the backseat passage. He positioned himself with the Bushmaster rifle aimed through the hole in the trunk. LaRufa locked the restaurant's front door and walked toward his car in the parking lot. Lee fired multiple times. The shots came in rapid succession. 5 bullets struck LaRufa, hitting him in various parts of his body. LaRufa fell in the parking lot, badly wounded. Muhammad drove the Caprice away immediately, disappearing into the night before anyone could identify the vehicle. But they weren't finished at the scene. Before leaving, they robbed LaRufa. Lee took LaRufa's laptop computer and approximately $3,500 in cash from the day's receipts. This wasn't just about killing anymore. Muhammad needed money to continue their operations, and robbery provided a practical benefit alongside the violence. Remarkably, Paul LaRufa survived. Despite being shot 5 times, none of the bullets hit vital organs or major arteries. Someone found him bleeding in the parking lot and called for an ambulance. Paramedics rushed him to a hospital where doctors worked to stabilize him. LaRufa underwent surgery and spent weeks recovering. 9 days passed. Muhammad and Lee stayed in the D.C. area, driving around, sleeping in the Caprice, and planning their next moves. Muhammad scouted additional locations carefully. He observed how police patrolled the suburbs. He noted which areas had security cameras and which didn't. He prepared detailed mental maps of the region. On September 14th, around 10:10 p.m., they struck again. Muhammad drove to Silver Spring, Maryland, another suburban community north of D.C. They targeted the Hill and Dale Beer and Wine liquor store. Rupinder Benny Oberoi, a 22-year-old employee, was working the closing shift. He had immigrated from India and worked at the store to support his family while pursuing his education. Oberoi stepped outside the store for a moment. Lee had the Bushmaster rifle positioned through the trunk hole. Muhammad had the Caprice parked where Lee could see the store entrance clearly. Lee fired once. The bullet struck Oberoi in the back. He fell immediately.
Co-workers inside the store heard something, but weren't sure what the sound was. When they realized Oberoi hadn't come back inside, someone went to check on him. They found him lying in the parking lot, bleeding from a gunshot wound. An ambulance arrived quickly. Paramedics worked on Oberoi at the scene before transporting him to a hospital. The bullet had caused serious damage, but Oberoi survived. He would spend time recovering from his injuries and would later participate in the civil lawsuit against Bushmaster Firearms and Bullseye Shooter Supply, seeking accountability for the negligence that allowed Muhammad and Lee to obtain the rifle. The next night, September 15th, Muhammad and Lee drove to Brandywine, Maryland. They found Three Roads Liquors, another liquor store in a suburban area. Muhammad Rashid was working as the clerk, preparing to close for the night. Rashid had no idea he was about to become the target of snipers who were testing their methods before launching a larger campaign of terror. Lee shot Rashid, who fell wounded but alive. The bullet hit him but didn't cause immediately fatal injuries. Someone called for emergency services. Rashid was transported to a hospital where he received treatment. He would make a full recovery and later become an important witness. Muhammad now had 3 suburban Maryland shootings completed. 2 victims survived. One was shot 5 times. Police in different jurisdictions investigated these crimes but didn't connect them. Each appeared to be a separate incident. The shootings occurred in different counties 9 to 10 days apart at different types of businesses. Detectives had no reason to suspect a serial shooter was operating. This was exactly what Muhammad wanted. He was testing whether attacks spread across different jurisdictions would be investigated separately, or whether police would identify a pattern. The lack of coordination between agencies told Muhammad that his plan could work.
On September 21st, Muhammad and Lee expanded their range dramatically. They drove south to Atlanta, Georgia. At 12:15 a.m., they found Sam's Package Store, a liquor store where Miliona Woodiarium worked. Woodiarium was a 41-year-old immigrant who had come to America seeking better opportunities. He worked hard to support his family and build a life. Woodiarium was helping the store owner close for the night when Muhammad and Lee arrived. This shooting differed from the others because they used a .22 caliber handgun instead of the Bushmaster rifle. Lee fired 3 times. 2 bullets hit Woodiarium in the head and back. He died at the scene. The store owner was devastated. Police arrived and processed the crime scene, collecting evidence and interviewing witnesses, but they had no leads on who committed the murder or why Woodiarium was targeted. 19 hours later, still on September 21st, Muhammad and Lee drove to Montgomery, Alabama. They targeted another liquor store. This shooting would later prove to be the most important mistake Muhammad made, though he didn't realize it at the time. Claudine Parker, a 52-year-old clerk, worked at the liquor store. She was friendly with customers and took pride in her work. Kelly Adams, a 24-year-old co-worker, was also on duty that evening. They had no warning that their store had been selected as a target. Lee entered the store in what appeared to be a robbery. He fired multiple shots. Parker was hit in the chest. The bullet caused massive trauma and she died quickly. Adams was shot through the neck. The bullet caused serious injury, but miraculously missed her carotid artery and other vital structures. She survived, but required extensive medical treatment. In the chaos of the shooting, Lee dropped a gun magazine. It fell to the floor and he left it behind when he fled. This magazine had his fingerprints on it. Lee didn't realize he had dropped it. Muhammad didn't know about it either. This single mistake would eventually lead to their identification and capture. 2 days later, on September 23rd, Muhammad and Lee drove to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. This was Muhammad's hometown, the place where he was born and raised. Returning to Baton Rouge demonstrated Muhammad's confidence that he wouldn't be caught. He felt invincible, untouchable by law enforcement. At 6:30 p.m., they targeted a beauty shop. Hong Yim Ballinger, a 45-year-old woman who managed the shop, was shot in the head with the Bushmaster rifle. She died instantly. Ballinger had immigrated from Korea and built a successful career in Baton Rouge. She was respected in the community and known for her professionalism. Baton Rouge police investigated her murder, but had nothing to work with. The shooting appeared random. Ballinger had no enemies, no conflicts, no reason anyone would want her dead. In less than 3 weeks during September 2002, Muhammad and Lee had killed 4 people and wounded 3 others across 4 states: Maryland, Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana. Each attack followed a similar pattern. Victims were targeted during routine activities at small businesses, shot from a distance, or during what appeared to be robberies, and left with no witnesses able to identify the shooters. Police in these different states didn't connect the crimes to each other. The attacks happened hundreds of miles apart. Some used the Bushmaster rifle, others used handguns. Some appeared to be robberies, others seemed motiveless. Each jurisdiction investigated independently, unaware that they were all dealing with the same 2 killers. This was exactly the confusion Muhammad had planned to create. By spreading attacks across multiple states and varying his methods, he made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to recognize a pattern. The September shootings had served their purpose as dress rehearsals and final tests. The modified Caprice worked perfectly. Lee performed his role without hesitation. The weapons functioned as expected. They could strike and escape without being identified. At the end of September, Muhammad and Lee positioned themselves for the main attacks. They were ready. Everything was in place. The real terror was about to begin.
Mohammed spent the last days of September driving through Montgomery County, Maryland, conducting detailed reconnaissance. This wasn't random exploration. Mohammed was selecting specific targets and planning precise attack sequences. He studied traffic patterns, noting when roads were busiest and when they were empty. He identified police patrol routes and timed how long it took for emergency vehicles to arrive at various locations after he triggered car alarms to test response times. He focused particularly on gas stations. These locations offered perfect conditions for his purposes. Victims would be standing still, vulnerable, focused on pumping fuel rather than watching their surroundings. Gas stations typically had open sight lines with few obstructions. They were located near major roads, making escape quick and easy. People visited gas stations constantly throughout the day, providing a steady stream of potential targets. Mohammed also studied shopping centers and their parking lots. He noted which stores had security guards and which didn't. He observed where security cameras were positioned and identified blind spots in their coverage. He looked for locations where the Caprice could park with clear views of pedestrians, but where the car itself wouldn't attract attention among other parked vehicles. Schools represented another category of target that particularly interested Mohammed. Attacking children would generate maximum terror and media attention. Schools had predictable schedules, with students arriving and leaving at specific times. Most schools had large open areas where students gathered outside. Mohammed drove past multiple schools, noting their layouts and security measures. He purchased a laptop computer to document his planning. Mohammed created detailed maps of Montgomery County and surrounding areas. He marked locations he had selected for attacks with icons. He drew routes showing how they would approach each location and which roads they would use to escape. He noted alternate routes in case their primary escape path was blocked. The planning was meticulous and methodical, the work of someone who had received military training in operational planning. Mohammed refined his timeline. He decided to launch the attacks on October 2, 2002. He would begin with multiple shootings in rapid succession to create maximum confusion and fear. Law enforcement would be overwhelmed, unable to protect everywhere simultaneously. While police scrambled to respond, Mohammed and Lee would continue attacking, demonstrating that no one was safe anywhere. During these final days, Mohammed talked constantly with Lee about their upcoming operation. He explained that what they were about to do would change American history. They would prove that a small group of determined individuals could paralyze the most powerful nation on earth. They would force the government to acknowledge their demands and pay the $10 million Mohammed would demand. Mohammed described in detail what they would do with the extortion money. They would drive to Canada, where Mohammed had already scouted potential locations for their base. They would establish a training camp in a remote area. Then Mohammed would begin recruiting young black men from broken homes, teenagers without fathers, boys who felt abandoned and angry, just as Lee had felt when Mohammed found him in Antigua. These recruits would be brought to the Canadian camp, where Mohammed would train them exactly as he had trained Lee. He would teach them weapon skills, tactical planning, and how to move undetected. He would condition them psychologically, breaking down their resistance to killing and rebuilding them as weapons. Then he would send them out across the United States to attack multiple cities simultaneously. Mohammed was planning a second wave of terror that could have dwarfed the first. On October 1st, Muhammad made his final preparations. He cleaned the Bushmaster rifle thoroughly, ensuring it would function perfectly. He inventoried their ammunition supply and confirmed they had enough .223 caliber rounds for the planned attacks. He checked the Caprice's mechanical condition, topping off fluids and verifying the tire pressure. He tested the rifle through the trunk hold one more time to ensure the modifications hadn't shifted or changed. Then he would send them out across the United States to attack multiple cities simultaneously. Muhammad was planning a second wave of terror that could have dwarfed the first. On October 1st, Muhammad made his final preparations. He cleaned the Bushmaster rifle thoroughly, ensuring it would function perfectly. He inventoried their ammunition supply and confirmed they had enough .223 caliber rounds for the planned attacks. He checked the Caprice's mechanical condition, topping off fluids and verifying the tire pressure. He tested the rifle through the trunk hole one more time to ensure the modifications hadn't shifted or changed.
October 2nd, 2002, started as an ordinary Wednesday in Montgomery County, Maryland. People woke up, got ready for work, sent their children to school, and began their daily routines with no awareness that this day would shatter their sense of safety forever. The weather was pleasant, typical for early fall in the Washington, D.C. area. Temperatures were mild, the sky was clear, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Muhammad and Lee woke up in the Caprice where they had spent the night. They had parked in a quiet area where the car wouldn't attract attention. Muhammad started the engine and drove to a fast food restaurant where they bought breakfast. They ate in the car as they had done countless times before. Around 5:20 p.m., Muhammad drove the Caprice into the parking lot of the Michael's Craft Store at 2 Halpine Plaza and Aspen Hill. The store was located along Randolph Road, a busy commercial corridor. Other stores and restaurants surrounded Michael's. People came and went constantly, shopping, running errands, going about their lives. Muhammad positioned the Caprice where Lee would have a clear shot through the store's large front windows. Lee climbed through the passage into the trunk. He lay flat, positioned the Bushmaster rifle through the hole near the license plate, and aimed through the scope. The rifle's magnification brought his view into sharp focus. Inside the store, Ann Chapman worked as a cashier at the checkout counter. She was helping customers, scanning items, making change, doing her job as she did every shift. Through the rifle scope, Lee could see her clearly. The rifle fired. The .223 caliber bullet traveled at high velocity through the air. It struck the large plate glass window at the front of the store. Glass shattered, exploding inward in a cascade of fragments. The bullet continued through the store, passing close to where Chapman stood, but it missed her. She wasn't hit. For a moment, confusion filled the store. The sound of shattering glass was loud and shocking. Chapman and other employees ducked instinctively. Customers dropped to the floor, unsure what had happened. Was it an accident? Had something fallen? Had a car crashed into the building? Chapman realized quickly that she had nearly been shot. She saw where the bullet had passed through the window, saw the trajectory that brought it terrifyingly close to where she stood. Her heart pounded, her hands shook.
Someone called the police. Montgomery County officers responded to the report of a shot fired at the Michael's store. They arrived to find the broken window, frightened employees, and confused customers. Officers searched for shell casings in the parking lot, but found none. Lee had fired from inside the closed trunk of the Caprice, so the spent shell casing remained inside the vehicle. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts of what they had seen or heard. No one had noticed the blue Caprice or connected it to the shooting. Muhammad had driven away calmly after the shot, not speeding, not drawing attention. Within minutes, they were miles from the scene. Police treated the incident as vandalism or possibly a stray bullet from somewhere nearby. Chapman had not been injured, so the urgency was lower than if someone had been shot. Officers took statements, photographed the damage, and filed a report. They had no reason to think this was an attempted murder or the beginning of something much worse. 1 hour later, at 6:30 p.m., Muhammad drove the Caprice to a different location in Montgomery County. They arrived at Shoppers Food Warehouse, a large grocery store at 2201 Randolph Road in Wheaton, about 4 miles from the Michaels store. The parking lot was busy with people finishing their workday shopping. Cars filled the spaces. Customers pushed shopping carts. People loaded groceries into their vehicles. Muhammad parked the Caprice in a position that gave Lee a clear view of the parking lot. The location was perfect. Multiple shoppers moved through the lot, providing several potential targets. The parking lot's layout allowed for a quick exit onto Randolph Road, where they could blend into traffic. James D. Martin had just finished shopping. Martin was 55 years old, married, and worked as a program analyst for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. He lived in Silver Spring with his wife Sharon. He was a dedicated government employee who took his work seriously and was well respected by his colleagues. His co-workers described him as quiet, competent, and reliable. Martin was an ordinary person living an ordinary life. He had stopped at the grocery store on his way home from work, as millions of people do every day. He bought the items on his list, paid at the checkout, and pushed his cart out to the parking lot. He reached his car and began loading grocery bags into the trunk. Lee had already climbed into the trunk of the Caprice. He positioned the Bushmaster rifle through the hole and scanned the parking lot through the scope. He saw Martin loading groceries, standing still, completely focused on his task and unaware that anyone was watching him. Lee centered the crosshairs on Martin's chest. He controlled his breathing, found the respiratory pause, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired. The bullet crossed the parking lot in a fraction of a second. It struck Martin in the chest, causing massive trauma. Martin collapsed between parked cars, falling heavily to the pavement. Grocery bags dropped around him. His car keys fell from his hand. Other shoppers heard the shot. The sound echoed across the parking lot, but most people couldn't identify what they had heard or where it came from. Some thought a car had backfired. Others thought someone had dropped something heavy. A few realized it was a gunshot, but they couldn't see the shooter or understand what was happening. Someone screamed. People began running for cover, ducking behind cars, rushing back into the store. A man who had been walking nearby saw Martin fall and rushed over to help. He found Martin bleeding heavily, unconscious, critically injured. The man shouted for someone to call 911. Other shoppers ran to assist. Some had medical training and tried to help Martin while waiting for an ambulance. They checked for a pulse, tried to stop the bleeding, but the damage was catastrophic. The bullet had struck vital structures in Martin's chest. His injuries were not survivable. Mohammed drove away from the parking lot immediately after the shot. He merged into traffic on Randolph Road, driving at normal speed, obeying traffic laws. The Caprice looked like any other car on the road. No one noticed it. No one connected it to the shooting that had just occurred. An ambulance arrived at Shoppers Food Warehouse within minutes. Paramedics rushed to Martin and began emergency treatment. They worked quickly, professionally, doing everything possible to save his life. But it was too late. James Martin died from his injuries. Montgomery County Police responded in force to the grocery store shooting. This was different from the Michaels incident an hour earlier. This was a fatal shooting in a busy public location. The region held its breath. The terror had truly begun. October 3rd, 2002, began at 7:41 a.m. Mohammed drove the Caprice to a mobile gas station in Aspen Hill, Maryland. Morning commuters filled their tanks before work. James Sonny Buchanan Jr., a 39-year-old landscaper, was mowing grass at the Fitzgerald Auto Mall across from the gas station. Lee positioned himself in the trunk. He aimed at Buchanan through the scope. He fired. The bullet struck Buchanan and he fell.
Co-workers rushed over, but Buchanan was dead. The sound of the lawnmower faded as paramedics arrived. Muhammad drove away before anyone realized what happened. 26 minutes later, at 8:07 a.m., Muhammad stopped the Caprice near another gas station in Aspen Hill. Primar Walakar, a 54-year-old part-time cab driver, stood at a gas pump filling his taxi. Lee fired once. Walakar collapsed at the pump. Other customers saw him fall, but didn't immediately understand he'd been shot. By the time they realized and called for help, Muhammad and Lee were gone. Walakar died at the scene. The shootings were happening so fast that police hadn't even finished processing the first scene when the second call came in. Dispatchers sent available units, but confusion was growing. Were these connected? Was there a serial killer in Montgomery County? At 8:12 a.m., just 5 minutes after killing Walakar, Muhammad drove to the Leisure World Shopping Center in Silver Spring, Maryland. Sarah Ramos, a 34-year-old woman, sat on a bench outside the shopping center. She was waiting for a bus. Lee aimed from the trunk and fired. The bullet hit Ramos and she slumped forward on the bench. A passerby thought she had fainted until they saw blood. Ramos died before the ambulance arrived. Muhammad kept driving. Lee stayed in the trunk, ready for the next target. They had 3 victims in 31 minutes, but they weren't finished. At 8:37 a.m., Muhammad drove to a Shell gas station in Kensington, Maryland. Lorianne Lewis Rivera, a 25-year-old mother, was vacuuming her van. She had dropped her children at daycare and was cleaning her vehicle before work. Lee fired from inside the trunk. Lewis Rivera was struck and fell. Another customer at the gas station ran over, thinking she had collapsed from a medical emergency. Then he saw the wound. Lewis Rivera died at the scene, leaving behind young children. Lee stayed in the trunk, ready for the next target. They had 3 victims in 31 minutes, but they weren't finished. At 8:37 a.m., Muhammad drove to a Shell gas station in Kensington, Maryland. Lorianne Lewis Rivera, a 25-year-old mother, was vacuuming her van. She had dropped her children at daycare and was cleaning her vehicle before work. Lee fired from inside the trunk. Lewis Rivera was struck and fell. Another customer at the gas station ran over, thinking she had collapsed from a medical emergency. Then he saw the wound. Lewis Rivera died at the scene, leaving behind young children. By 9 a.m., Montgomery County Police realized they had a crisis. 4 people dead in slightly over an hour, all shot from distance, all in public places. The chief of police, Charles Moose, mobilized every available officer. Roadblocks went up across the county. Police stopped and searched white vans and box trucks because early witness reports mentioned seeing such vehicles near the crime scenes. But these witness reports were wrong. Muhammad was driving a blue sedan that looked like thousands of other cars on the road. While police searched for white vans, Muhammad and Lee continued their work. At 9:20 that evening, more than 12 hours after the morning shootings, Muhammad drove to a residential area in Washington, D.C. Pascal Charlot, a 72-year-old retired carpenter, was walking home along Georgia Avenue at Collier Road. Lee fired from the trunk. Charlot was hit and fell on the sidewalk. A neighbor heard the shot and ran out to find Charlot bleeding. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, but he died less than an hour later. By the end of October 3, 2002, 5 people were dead. James Buchanan, Primar Walakar, Sarah Ramos, Lorianne Lewis Rivera, and Pascal Charlot. All had been going about their normal daily activities. None had any connection to each other or to Muhammad and Lee. They were random targets selected for maximum impact and terror. October 4th brought a brief pause. No shootings occurred that day as Muhammad and Lee laid low, watching the news coverage of their attacks.
Every channel showed the same images: yellow police tape, crime scene investigators, and frightened residents. On October 7th at 8:09 a.m., Mohammed drove to Benjamin Tasker Middle School in Bowie, Maryland. Iran Grown, a 13-year-old student, arrived at school. His family had recently immigrated to the United States. His mother dropped him off at the entrance. Lee aimed carefully through the hole in the trunk. He fired once. The bullet struck Iran in the chest. The boy fell on the steps of the school. Students screamed and ran inside. Teachers rushed out to help. An ambulance arrived quickly. Iran Brown survived, but his chest injury was serious and required extensive medical treatment. At the crime scene, investigators found something new: a tarot card. Specifically, they found the death card from a tarot deck. On the front, someone had written, "Call me God." On the back, on 3 separate lines, was a message: "For you, Mr. Police. Code: Call me God. Do not release to the press." Chief Moose told his team to keep the tarot card secret, hoping to use it to identify the real shooter from false tips. But within 24 hours, WSA-TV reported the card's existence. The Washington Post followed with details. The information was public, frustrating investigators who wanted to control what the killer knew about their investigation. The shooting of a child at school brought new urgency. Montgomery County Public Schools immediately went into lockdown. Outdoor activities were canceled. Recess was held indoors. Physical education classes moved to gymnasiums. On October 9th at 8:18 p.m., the shootings resumed. Dean Harold Myers, a 53-year-old civil engineer from Gaithersburg, Maryland, stopped at a Sunoco gas station in Manassas, Virginia. He pumped gas into his car. Lee fired from the trunk of the Caprice. Myers was hit in the chest and died at the scene. This was the first shooting in Virginia, expanding the geographic range dramatically. Police in Virginia joined the investigation, which now involved multiple jurisdictions and dozens of agencies. The FBI established a joint operations center to coordinate the response. October 11th brought another victim. Kenneth Bridges, a 53-year-old businessman from Philadelphia, stopped at an Exxon station near Fredericksburg, Virginia. He was traveling on Interstate 95 heading south for a business trip. At approximately 9:30 a.m., he stood at the pump. Lee fired. Bridges fell, mortally wounded. He died at the scene. Police set up massive roadblocks on I-95, stopping and searching hundreds of vehicles. They were still looking for white vans and box trucks. Mohammed drove the blue Caprice right past several roadblocks without being stopped. His vehicle didn't match the description police had given to officers. The next shooting happened on October 14th. Linda Franklin, a 47-year-old FBI intelligence analyst, finished shopping at a Home Depot in Falls Church, Virginia, with her husband. They loaded purchases into their car in the parking lot at 9:15 p.m. Lee fired from across the parking lot. The bullet struck Franklin in the head. She died instantly. Her husband, standing next to her, wasn't injured. The murder of an FBI employee escalated the investigation dramatically. The FBI committed even more resources. Federal agents joined local police in a massive task force. The attack also showed that no one was safe, not even law enforcement professionals. By mid-October, the region was paralyzed with fear. People ran between their cars and buildings in zigzag patterns, hoping to avoid being hit. Gas stations erected tarps to shield customers from sightlines. Schools remained on high alert. Many residents simply stayed home, avoiding any unnecessary trips outside. The psychological impact was enormous. Mohammed had achieved his goal of creating widespread terror.
On October 19, 2002, Mohammed and Lee drove to Ashton, Virginia, about 83 miles south of Washington, D.C. It was 8 p.m. when they arrived at a Ponderosa Steakhouse parking lot. Jeffrey Hopper, a 37-year-old man, finished dinner with his wife, Stephanie. They walked toward their car. Lee fired from inside the trunk. The bullet struck Hopper in the torso. He fell in the parking lot. Stephanie screamed for help. Other customers ran out of the restaurant. Someone called 911. What made this shooting different was what investigators found afterward. Mohammed had left a 4-page letter in the woods near the steakhouse. The letter was placed in a plastic bag and attached to a tree. This was the communication police had been hoping for. The letter began with a cover sheet that said, "For you, Mr. Police, call me God, do not release to the press." The letter demanded $10 million. It instructed police to deposit the money in a Bank of America account that would have unlimited withdrawal capability worldwide. The letter complained about police telephone hotlines. Mohammed and Lee had apparently tried to call police several times, but the operators either didn't take them seriously or couldn't understand what they wanted. The letter specifically named some operators and called them incompetent. The most disturbing part was a direct threat. "Your children are not safe anywhere at any time." This sentence confirmed everyone's worst fears. The shooters had already targeted a 13-year-old boy at school. Now they were explicitly threatening children. Chief Moose held a press conference and carefully referenced parts of the letter without revealing its full contents. He said, "Our word is our bond," trying to establish communication while protecting operational details. The letter also mentioned a previous shooting in Montgomery, Alabama. Mohammed specifically told police to investigate that case. This was a crucial mistake. On October 22nd, the final shooting occurred. Conrad Johnson, a 35-year-old bus driver, was standing on the steps of his Montgomery County ride-on bus at 5:56 a.m. in Aspen Hill, Maryland. He was preparing to start his morning route. Lee fired from the Caprice. Johnson was hit and fell. He died shortly after. Johnson was beloved in his community. He was a father and a dedicated public servant who drove the same route every day. His death devastated the neighborhood he served. By October 24th, police had identified Mohammed and Malvo as suspects. They issued a BOLO, "Be on the lookout," for Mohammed, Malvo, and the blue Caprice with New Jersey license plate NDA21Z. The information went to police departments across the region and was released to the media and broadcast widely. Truckers were specifically asked to watch for the vehicle since highway travel made it easier to spot. Mohammed and Lee didn't know police had identified them. They continued to sleep in the Caprice, driving around the area, watching the news on a small television Mohammed had brought. They saw their vehicle description broadcast, but apparently didn't believe police would actually find them. On the evening of October 23rd, Mohammed drove to a rest stop on Interstate 70 in Myersville, Maryland. He parked the Caprice in a parking space. He and Lee settled in for the night. The rest stop was relatively empty. They felt safe enough to sleep. What they didn't know was that a truck driver had seen the broadcast about the blue Caprice and its license plate number. As he pulled into the same rest stop around 11:45 p.m., he noticed a blue Caprice matching the description. He wrote down the license plate, NDA21Z. It matched exactly. The truck driver called 911 from his cell phone. He reported the location and the vehicle. Dispatchers immediately contacted the FBI and local police. Within minutes, law enforcement began moving into position. This was the moment they had been waiting for. After 3 weeks of terror and 13 shootings across multiple states, they finally had the snipers cornered. At approximately midnight on October 24, 2002, police and federal agents began surrounding the rest stop on Interstate 70. They moved quietly without lights or sirens. Maryland State Police, Montgomery County SWAT officers, FBI hostage rescue team members, and ATF agents took positions around the parking lot. The blue Caprice sat in a parking space with Muhammad and Lee sleeping inside. The FBI hostage rescue team took the lead. At 3:19 a.m., the team moved in. Officers surrounded the Caprice with weapons drawn. They shouted commands for the occupants to show their hands and exit the vehicle. Bright spotlights illuminated the car. Muhammad and Lee were asleep when the shouts woke them. They were surrounded before they could react. Muhammad later said he considered reaching for the rifle in the trunk, but realized it was impossible. Officers ordered them to exit slowly with their hands visible. Muhammad and Lee complied. They got out of the car one at a time, following exact instructions from officers. They were ordered to lie face down on the pavement. Officers approached cautiously, handcuffed them, and moved them away from the vehicle. The arrest was completed without any shots fired. After 3 weeks of living in fear, residents of the Washington, D.C. region learned that the Beltway snipers were in custody. The news spread quickly. People gathered around televisions to watch the coverage. Relief mixed with exhaustion and grief for the victims. With Muhammad and Lee secured, investigators began processing the Caprice. What they found confirmed their worst fears and provided crucial evidence for trial. The car had been completely modified to serve as a mobile sniper platform. The trunk showed clear modifications. A hole approximately 2 inches in diameter had been cut near the license plate. From inside the trunk, someone lying prone could aim a rifle through this hole and fire at targets while remaining completely hidden. The back seat had been altered. Sheet metal connecting the passenger compartment to the trunk had been removed, creating a passage. Lee could climb from the back seat into the trunk while the car was moving. From outside, the Caprice looked like a normal vehicle. Investigators found the Bushmaster XM15 rifle in the trunk, with a Bushnell holographic sight attached. Malvo's fingerprints were on the rifle. Muhammad's DNA was also found on it. Ballistics testing would later match this rifle to 11 of the 14 shootings, including all 10 fatal shootings in the D.C. area. In the car was Paul LaRufa's laptop, stolen during the September 5th shooting in Clinton, Maryland. The laptop contained maps that Muhammad had created. He had marked shooting locations with icons. He had drawn escape routes from several crime scenes. The level of planning was remarkable, the work of someone who had received military training in operational planning. Police found the Chevrolet Caprice owner's manual. FBI laboratory technicians later discovered written impressions on the manual, evidence that Muhammad had written some of his demand letters while using the manual as a hard surface underneath his paper. A digital voice recorder contained messages Muhammad and Lee had prepared for police. These recordings made extortion demands and threats. The voice on the recordings was later identified as Muhammad's. The car also contained maps of various cities, walkie-talkies that Muhammad and Lee used to communicate during planning phases, and other items connecting them to the shootings. When investigators looked into the September 21st shooting at the Alabama liquor store, they found that someone had dropped a magazine at the scene. That magazine had fingerprints on it. On October 17th, authorities matched those fingerprints to Boyd Malvo. His prints were on file because of his December 2001 arrest by Border Patrol in Washington State.
Once they had Malvo's identity, they researched his background and found his connection to John Allen Muhammad. ATF records showed Muhammad had been seen with a Bushmaster rifle in Tacoma, Washington. Federal agents discovered Muhammad had a restraining order against him from his ex-wife, which legally prohibited him from possessing firearms. This gave them grounds for federal weapons violation charges. Investigators traveled to Tacoma, Washington to research Muhammad and Lee's time there. They interviewed neighbors who remembered seeing Muhammad and Lee target shooting in the woods. One neighbor, Robert Holmes, testified that Muhammad had introduced Lee to him as a sniper. Muhammad had also discussed making a silencer for the rifle. Police talked to staff at Bullseye Shooter Supply, the gun store where Lee had shoplifted the Bushmaster rifle. Store records were incomplete, but ATF audits showed Bullseye had lost track of 238 guns in the 3 years before the sniper attacks. More than 50 guns from Bullseye had been traced to crimes between 1997 and 2001. The store's negligent practices made it easy for Lee to steal the rifle without detection. Investigators examined Muhammad's background thoroughly. They learned about his military service, his expert marksmanship badge, and his Gulf War deployment. They reviewed his custody battle with Mildred Muhammad, the restraining order she had obtained. They discovered he had kidnapped his 3 children in 1999 and fled to Antigua. They interviewed Mildred Muhammad, who told them about his increasingly erratic behavior and his obsession with maintaining control. She lived near the Capitol Beltway in Clinton, Maryland, right in the area where several shootings occurred. They also researched Lee's background. They contacted his mother, Una James, in Florida, who was devastated. She told them about meeting Muhammad in Antigua and how he had seemed like a positive influence on her son. She never suspected Muhammad was grooming Lee for violence. Immigration and Naturalization Service records showed Lee had entered the United States illegally and was arrested near the Canadian border in December 2001. In October 2003, John Allen Muhammad's trial began in Virginia Beach, Virginia. The trial had been moved there from Prince William County because extensive pre-trial publicity made it impossible to find impartial jurors in the original venue. Muhammad was charged with the October 9, 2002 murder of Dean Harold Myers at the Manassas gas station, plus 3 additional charges: murder with intent to terrorize, conspiracy to commit murder, and illegal use of a firearm. The prosecution, led by Paul Ert, spent 6 weeks presenting evidence to prove Muhammad orchestrated the murders and ordered Lee Malvo to help carry them out. They called 130 witnesses and introduced over 400 pieces of evidence. The case was largely circumstantial since no eyewitness saw Muhammad pull the trigger. Key evidence included the Bushmaster rifle found in Muhammad's car that ballistics linked to 8 of the 10 D.C. area killings, plus 2 others in Louisiana and Alabama. The modified Caprice with the shooting hole in the trunk and a laptop containing maps with shooting locations marked proved the premeditation. Lee Boyd Malvo testified at Muhammad's trial, though his testimony was complicated. He initially claimed to be the triggerman in all shootings to protect Muhammad from the death penalty. But under cross-examination, his story shifted and he provided details about Muhammad's role as planner and leader. The defense argued that prosecutors hadn't proven Muhammad personally pulled the trigger and pointed out Lee's fingerprints were on the rifle. However, Virginia law allowed capital murder convictions for both the actual killer and the person who ordered the killing when the crime involved terrorism. After 6 weeks of testimony and 6 hours of jury deliberation on November 17, 2003, the jury found Muhammad guilty on all 4 counts. A separate penalty phase followed where prosecutors presented evidence of Muhammad's lack of remorse and continuing threat to society, while the defense presented mitigating evidence about his difficult childhood and military service. On November 24, 2003, the jury recommended the death penalty, which the judge formally imposed on March 9, 2004. Muhammad showed no emotion when the sentence was pronounced.
Lee Boyd Malvo's trial began in Chesapeake, Virginia in November 2003, shortly after Muhammad's conviction. Lee faced 2 capital murder charges, killing FBI analyst Linda Franklin in an act of terrorism and killing more than 1 person within 3 years. He also faced a firearms charge. The prosecution team was led by Robert Horn, a veteran prosecutor. Lee's defense team included Craig Cooley, a prominent Richmond attorney, along with other specialists. The core argument was that Malvo had been so completely controlled and manipulated by Muhammad that he wasn't mentally capable of forming criminal intent. His attorneys presented forensic psychologists to explain how Muhammad had systematically broken down Lee's sense of self over 2 years through isolation, abuse, indoctrination, and creating complete dependency. The defense presented evidence of Muhammad's grooming tactics, showing how he alternated between praise and criticism to control Lee's behavior, classic predatory manipulation. Lee himself testified, describing how Muhammad seemed caring when they first met and gradually took over his life, making him feel powerless to refuse orders. The prosecution vigorously challenged this defense, arguing that Lee was intelligent, knew right from wrong, and had opportunities to ask for help, but never did. They emphasized that Lee made active choices, including stealing the rifle and pulling the trigger. The jury deliberated for nearly 14 hours over 2 days before finding Lee guilty on both capital murder charges and the firearms charge on December 18, 2003, rejecting the insanity defense. During the penalty phase, prosecutors sought the death penalty, but Lee's youth and the abuse he suffered created more sympathy than Muhammad received. On December 23, 2003, the jury recommended life in prison without possibility of parole rather than death. Judge Rausch formally sentenced Lee to life on March 10, 2004, to be served at Red Onion State Prison, Virginia Supermax facility.
In May 2006, Maryland authorities prosecuted both Muhammad and Lee for the 6 Montgomery County murders. Lee agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for his cooperation and testimony against Muhammad at his Maryland trial, prosecutors would not seek additional death penalties. Lee pleaded guilty to all 6 murders. On November 8, 2006, a Maryland judge sentenced Lee to 6 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Combined with his Virginia sentences, Lee faced 10 life terms plus 8 years. Muhammad's Maryland trial occurred in May 2006. Lee testified against him, providing details about their relationship and the planning of the attacks. Lee admitted he had lied during Muhammad's first trial when he claimed to be the sole triggerman. He testified that he said this to try to save Muhammad from the death penalty. Muhammad was convicted in Maryland and received additional sentences. However, Virginia had jurisdiction for his execution based on his first conviction there. After sentencing, Lee Boyd Malvo began his life sentence at Red Onion State Prison in Virginia. Red Onion is a supermax facility designed for the most dangerous inmates. Prisoners spend 23 hours per day in their cells, with 1 hour for recreation in a small enclosed area. The conditions are harsh. Cells measure approximately 8 by 10 feet. Lee had time to think about what he had done. His attorneys and a social worker, Coretta Alberius, continued visiting him. They helped him process his experiences with Muhammad and understand the psychological control he had been under. Slowly, Lee began to separate his real identity from what Muhammad had created. In September 2012, Lee gave a lengthy interview to the Washington Post. It was his only face-to-face media interview. He called himself a monster for what he had done. He expressed genuine remorse and said he had spent years working through guilt while in solitary confinement. Lee explained that without access to therapy or counseling programs, he had to be his own therapist. He read extensively, thought about his actions, and tried to understand how he had become a killer.
In October 2007, Lee reached out to Cheryl Witz, the daughter of victim Jerry Taylor, who was killed in Arizona. Lee called her to apologize. This began a correspondence between them. Witz later became one of the people supporting Lee's resentencing efforts, believing he deserved a chance at eventual parole given his age and circumstances. Meanwhile, John Allen Muhammad spent his final years on death row at Sussex I State Prison in Virginia. Death row conditions were similar to supermax facilities: solitary confinement, minimal contact with others, and limited recreation time. Throughout his incarceration, Muhammad maintained his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against him. He never admitted pulling the trigger or planning the attacks. He showed no remorse for the victims or their families. To Muhammad, his prosecution was not justice, but persecution. Muhammad filed multiple appeals challenging his conviction and death sentence. His main arguments centered on Virginia's triggerman law. Muhammad's attorneys argued that prosecutors hadn't proven he personally fired the fatal shot that killed Dean Myers. Virginia courts rejected this argument repeatedly. The state's law allowed capital murder convictions for both the actual killer and the person who ordered the killing when certain circumstances existed. As 2009 progressed and Muhammad's execution date approached, his attorneys made final appeals to Virginia Governor Tim Kaine. They asked the governor to commute Muhammad's sentence to life in prison. They argued Muhammad had mental health issues stemming from his difficult childhood. Governor Kaine reviewed the case thoroughly, but declined to grant clemency. He found no reason to overturn the jury's verdict. On November 10, 2009, the day before his scheduled execution, Muhammad's final appeal was denied by the U.S. Supreme Court. There would be no last-minute reprieve. The execution would proceed as scheduled. On November 10, 2009, John Allen Muhammad rose from his prison cot for the final time. Minutes before 9 o'clock in the evening, John Allen Muhammad was escorted into the execution chamber at Greensville Correctional Center. Flanked by guards and dressed in denim prison clothing, he stepped into the small room where a cross-shaped gurney awaited him. There was no ceremony, no hesitation. The execution team moved with efficiency, securing his arms, legs, and torso with thick leather and nylon straps. Muhammad offered no resistance. He lay on the gurney as the team completed their preparations. At exactly 9 o'clock in the evening, the execution team stepped back. The warden approached and spoke the required words. "Mr. Muhammad, do you have any last words?" Silence. No plea, no apology, no defiance. Muhammad did not turn his head or lift his eyes. He simply lay there, unmoving. After a signal from the warden, the execution team administered the lethal injection protocol through intravenous lines. Virginia used a 3-drug sequence: sodium thiopental to induce unconsciousness, pancuronium bromide to paralyze muscles and stop breathing, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. The drugs were administered at 9:06 in the evening. For a moment, there was stillness, then a twitch, a blink. Muhammad took 7 deep breaths, each one slower than the last, until there were none. His chest stopped rising. His body went completely still. At exactly 9:11 in the evening, John Allen Muhammad was pronounced dead. The time didn't go unnoticed. Among those present, a murmur spread through the witness area.
He was pronounced dead at 9/11, the same numbers as the September 11 attacks that Muhammad had reportedly admired. People had gathered on both sides of the issue. Some held opposing the death penalty, carrying signs and candles, praying for an end to capital punishment. Others supported the execution as justice for the victims, believing Muhammad deserved to die for the terror he had inflicted. The execution marked the end of John Allen Muhammad's life, but not the end of the story. Boyd Malvo remained in prison, serving multiple life sentences and navigating complex legal battles over his juvenile sentencing. Victims' families continued dealing with their losses. Some found ways to move forward, while others remained trapped by grief and trauma. The Beltway sniper case revealed how one man's rage, combined with a vulnerable teenager's desperation for belonging, could hold an entire nation hostage with fear. 10 innocent lives were stolen, families were shattered, cities were paralyzed. But perhaps most importantly, the case exposed how the absence of love, Muhammad's loss of his mother at 3, Lee's abandonment by his own, can create wounds so deep that they poison everything that follows. In the end, both men became monsters, but one was made and one was broken. Understanding this distinction